Good morning, welcome back. Today is July 24th, and I'm sitting at a little bit of a different angle today because number one, I wanted to keep out of the way of the umbrella, but number two, I wanted you to see more of the flower bestrewn deck. We are approaching the peak of the flower bestrewn deck, so we want to get as many shots of it as we can. Some interesting stuff happened on this day in history. It was on this date in 1567 that Mary Queen of Scots was forced to abdicate the throne of Scotland. Her son takes over and becomes known as James VI. Now, Mary Queen of Scots is a relative of Elizabeth I, cousin actually, and she became the Queen of England, or the Queen of Scotland, even though she had been raised in France. She'd had a lot of run-ins with John Knox, the great Presbyterian minister, preacher up there at that time, but ultimately she's forced to abdicate from the throne, and she ends up in England for protection. Although there in England she's ultimately seen as a threat, and about 18 years later she's actually executed as being part of a plot to overthrow Elizabeth I. Ironically, when Elizabeth I dies, it's Mary Queen of Scots' son, James VI of Scotland, who becomes the King of England. But when he becomes the King of England, he's known as James I, who's famous for many things, not the least of which is the creation of the King James Bible, which many of us grew up reading. It was on this date in 1824 that a Harrisburg, Pennsylvania newspaper published the first public opinion poll, the results, I should say, of the first public opinion poll, and I think it's been pretty much downhill ever since. But that was in 1824. For you Chicago residents, it was on this date in 1915 that the Eastland disaster occurred. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Eastland disaster was a ship, the SS Eastland, that was docked in the Chicago River between Clark and LaSalle Street on the south side of the river. So if you ever cross over Clark Street, look to your right, there it is, where the ship was. It was a ship that could hold 2,500 people, and it was destined that day, along with several others, to take employees of the Western Electric phone company, mostly from Cicero, to Michigan City, Indiana for a picnic. Now, as they loaded onto this particular boat, this boat had a reputation for being top-heavy in and of itself, and then because of results of the Titanic disaster, which had just happened just 3 years prior, additional boats had to be, lifeboats had to be added, so they just added them to the top, which made this boat very, very top-heavy. So ultimately, the boat, the Eastland, reached its capacity, 2,500 people, and for reasons that are really not yet known, most of the people, I shouldn't say most, but a large number of people that were just on the top shifted over to the north side of the boat to kind of see not the dock side, but the other side, and as a result of this top-heavy and all of the people shifting, the boat simply rolled over into the water and sank. Now, keep in mind, the boat itself was only about 20 feet away from the dock, and the boat was only in about 20 feet of water. And yet, because of the nature, there were so many people on this boat, many of them under deck, that ultimately 844 people died. It's still the largest, most significant loss of life in a Great Lakes-related shipping disaster. 844 people died. There was a memorial put up to it in 1990, but then somebody stole the memorial, and so in true Chicago fashion, and then another memorial was put up in 2003, which is now at the intersection of, I believe, Wacker and LaSalle Street. So LaSalle is in east, it's a north-south street, and Wacker goes right along the Chicago River there. But that took place on this date in 1915. Birthdays today. In 1874, Oswald Chambers was born. Oswald Chambers, born in Scotland, a preacher, teacher, best known for his work, My Utmost for His Highest. He was part of the Holiness movement, which was a offspring, derivative, so to speak, out of Methodism, the Methodist movement, the Holiness movement, which kind of is the transition between Methodism and the Charismatic or the rise of the Pentecostal denomination. Holiness basically dealt with second baptism of the Spirit, Christian perfectionism, sinless perfectionism, that you could reach a point where you could be sinless. and Oswald Chambers was a great advocate for that. But he was born on this date in 1874, died in 1917. And in 1921, Cyrus Scofield died. C.I. Scofield had been a lawyer, was converted, and then went into the ministry, became a preacher. But most of us, when we think of C.I. Scofield, we think of the Scofield Reference Bible. Now, I know you think I picked up a King James Version earlier, which I did, but it was not just any King James Version. This, of course, is a Scofield Reference Bible, an old Scofield Reference Bible, which, of course, most of us, I shouldn't say most, many of us grew up. In fact, I think I have, there's five of them in our house right at this moment. So Scofield, very famous for advocating the day-age theory or the gap theory and dispensationalism. One of the reasons why dispensationalism was so popular was because we were all looking at the Scofield Reference Bible. And finally, interestingly enough, it was on this date in 1955 that George W. Hensley is bitten by a snake. Okay, so George W. Hensley was bitten by a snake, and he would die the next day. So he dies July 24th, 1955. Now, many of you are thinking, well, so what? George W. Hensley also gets bitten by a snake. Well, when you realize that what George W. Hensley did for his living was he was a snake handler. He was a Pentecostal preacher who would hold snakes and show that based on passages in the Bible, Mark chapter 16, where it says they'll be able to take up serpents, took that quite seriously. And so he ultimately reached his end. Now, again, you can't really you say, oh, well, I guess he got his because he died when he was 74 years old. He had been handling snakes for years and years and years. So ultimately, it came back to bite him. See what I did there? But he was bitten by the snake that killed him on this date in 1955. Okay, well, that's it. Let's get back to talking about Revelation. Luke 22. A lot of good stuff as we continue winding up the book of Luke. So let's get back to that. Good morning, welcome back. We're here to talk about Luke 22, continuing our discussion from last week. Again, usually I've tried to go one chapter per session, but there was just too much stuff going on in Luke 22. So I'm going to continue on here. If you remember when we last left our heroes, we were in what often is referred to as the upper room, but it was the final Passover that Jesus is having with his disciples. He had we talked about instituting the Lord's Supper, what we call the Lord's Supper, what that indicates, what that means. And then he had warned that the disciples, that the person who betrayed them, and the interesting thing was that nobody knew that it was Judas. Okay, so what that tells you is that there had been nothing in Judas's life or activities or behavior that would signal him out. Okay, so we're at the table. They've just been told that Jesus is, things are going to change tomorrow. That there's going to be there's somebody who's going to betray him is sitting at the table. That then they got in this argument about who's going to be the greatest or not. And so with that idea, and then that Jesus says, but don't worry, at some point you're going to rule. You're going to have a kingdom, just like I have a kingdom. Okay. Now, with the idea, sitting around the table with the idea that there's somebody there that's going to betray them, suddenly Jesus turns to Peter. And he starts talking to Peter. And I'm in Luke 22, beginning with verse 31. Okay, if you remember, Peter's original given name is Simon. And so Simon Peter, sometimes he's called Simon Peter. But he turns to Simon. Okay, now, collectively, the 12 disciples know that one person is going to betray them. That one person that we know is Judas. Okay, and we talked about what Judas is meant to do, or what he thinks he's doing. And I think what he thinks he's doing and what actually happens are two different things. And we talked about that last week. But still, 11 of the people in that table don't know what Jesus is talking about. But then he turns to Simon. Okay, and he says, verse 31, Simon, Simon, Satan has asked to sift all of you as wheat. Okay? But I have prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned, strengthen your brothers. Now, again, Jesus has just said to the group, one of you is going to betray me. Okay? That all of this is going to happen because somebody's going to betray me. And then he turns to Simon and says, Simon, I'm really praying for you that when your faith fails. Okay, so in the mind of the 12 people sitting around the table, or the rest of the people sitting around the table, what is Jesus doing? Again, I'm speculating, but it sure seems to me that what Jesus is saying is that you're the one that's going to do this to me. Well, why not? Okay, well, Simon, that's one perspective, okay? However, you could also look at it and say that Simon is, Peter is probably the oldest disciple. Okay, again, this is kind of inferred from a number of things. One, we know he's married. We know he's got a mother-in-law from Jesus raising his mother-in-law in Mark, or in Luke as well. But so we know he's probably the oldest, and so perhaps it's seen by the people, by those around the table, as Simon as the leader of the group. That he's, Simon, I'm praying for you so that when your faith, meaning you all's faith, although the verb there is singular. Okay, so it could be looked at that way, and maybe that's how Simon took it. Okay, but what he really does is he kind of gets defensive a little bit here, guys. See, but I pray for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail. And when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. Now, before I get into Simon's response, let me just say that, so Jesus tells Simon, your faith is going to fail, okay? But you're going to come back, okay? But if you turn back, strengthen your brothers, okay? And I think this is a great assurance that Jesus knows what's going to happen, knows what Simon is going to do, what Peter is going to do. But he's like, you're going to come back, and when you do, strengthen your brothers. Okay, so we may, he knows whether we're going to fail or not. He also knows whether we're going to come back. Okay, but he, that is Simon, replies, Lord, I'm ready to go with you to prison and to death. Okay, Simon, Peter doesn't want to be, wants everybody to be clear. No, I am not the one that's going to be doing the betraying. Okay, it's not going to be me. I'm ready to follow Jesus to death, to prison and to death. No problem. You got me. I'm on your side. Okay. Jesus answered, I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows today, you will deny 3 times that you know me. What can Peter say at this point? Nothing. I mean, all he can do is think, no, I won't. No, I won't. And so I'm sure that Peter, this is eating at him, right? This is bugging him, okay? And again, I'm just kind of imagining how the situation played out. But I imagine it kind of just bugged him, All right? But Jesus changes the subject again, okay? He moves on. He says, then Jesus asked them, now he's talking to the group again, when I sent you without purse, bag, or sandals, did you lack anything? Nothing, they answered, okay? Now, he's referring to I think he's referring to the events of Luke 9 and 10. If you remember, he sends out the 12, and then then the next chapter he sends out the 72, which probably included the 12 as well. Okay, and they go out and they cast out demons, and that's where it says, go into a town, and if they accept you, stay there. If they don't accept you, shake the dust off your feet and, come out. Okay, so he says, when I did that, did you lack anything? And they say, no. Okay. And now the implication is that something similar is going to happen. Again, everything's changing tomorrow. Something similar is going to happen. You are being sent out, not in the same friendly way that I sent you out before, but you're being sent out nonetheless. But things are going to be a little different this time. Okay. He said to them, but now, if you have a purse, take it, and also a bag. And if you don't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. It is written, and he was numbered with the transgression. And I tell you that this must be fulfilled in me. Yes, what was written about me is reaching its fulfillment. Okay, so things are going to be different this time. So when you get sent out the next time, which is going to happen after tomorrow. He doesn't say that, but he knows that that's what's going to happen, that you're going to be sent out. You're going to have to provide for yourself. You're going to have to provide your own clothes. You may have to fight. Okay, there may be some physical altercations about it. Okay, so Jesus is looking beyond the weekend. He's looking beyond the death, burial, and resurrection. He's saying, here's what's going to happen in the long term, and here's how you're going to have to. Here's how you're going to have to present it. Here's how you're going to have to face it. Okay, and he says, you don't have swords, sell your cloak and buy one. It is written, and he was numbered with the transgressors. Okay, now this is from Isaiah 53. He's kind of pulling this, and here Jesus is predicting it, and of course we know that later on is he's put in with just common criminals, and he's crucified between two thieves. Okay, and he says at some point, Christianity or followers of the way, as it's called as we get into Acts, followers of the way are going to be considered lawbreakers. Okay, and they're going to be arrested and thrown in jail. Okay, for breaking the law, for being transgressors. Okay, now here, this is what's going to happen to you. Okay, he's just kind of warning you that this is what's going to happen. He's kind of looking far down the line. Now the disciples are, again, they, and I get a kick sometimes out of these conversations, because it sometimes happens where, if you've ever had one of those kind of conversations where you make a statement about something, and then somebody, you want to talk about the greatest, you saw the greatest movie of all time. Okay. You come into a room and you say, I saw the greatest movie on Saturday. Okay. And you want to talk about how great that movie is, or you say, I went to the Cinemark, or pick your movie, the Tivoli, whatever movie theater you want, right? I went to the Tivoli on Saturday and I saw the greatest movie ever. Let me tell you about it. And somebody immediately starts saying something along the line of, really? I don't really like the Tivoli. Did you get their popcorn? It really wasn't that good. And you want to talk about this great movie. You want to talk about the great script, the tremendous acting, the symbolism, and the how moved you were, and all this person wants to talk about is, and then everyone else goes, oh yeah, I like the popcorn there. Did you try the jujubes? Those are great. What about the candy? Et cetera. Well, what about the popcorn over at the Seven Bridges? Okay, and suddenly you brought in, and you want to talk about this great film you've seen, this great characterization, this great writing. Everything is great about it, and all anybody around you wants to talk about is the theater you saw it in. Okay. And we've all been in situations like that, and we've all probably contributed. We've all probably been the popcorn question person, or where we've questioned the thing without missing, and then somebody sooner or later, and if you've ever been on any kind of leadership board, this happens all the time, where somebody will come in with a question, or there's a topic to discuss, and leadership boards are notorious for just going off topic kind of thing, where we need to make a statement on this movie, oh, well, where are we going to watch it? We're thinking of Tivoli. Oh, I don't like the Tivoli. And then the discussion goes off on what theater you should watch it in. Okay. But I say that, I digress. Back to the subject at hand. Okay. So Jesus gives this discussion about, okay, you're going to have to get a cloak. You're going to have to buy food. You're going to have to get sandals. You're going to have to buy a sword. Okay. The disciples glom onto that sword statement, because they say here in verse 38, the disciples said, see, Lord, here are two swords. Now, the Greek word here is sword. I mean, it's not like short knife. I mean, these are swords, all right? And that was, of course, the main weapon here. And Jesus says, that's enough. He replied at the end of verse 38. Now, let's be clear here. This is not a Second Amendment passage here. This is not talking about the right to bear arms or anything. Jesus' statement, that's enough, is not saying, great, that's what we need, just two swords will be just enough to defend us. Okay, that's enough. That's enough for this conversation. Okay, he's like, that's enough. We don't need to talk about this anymore. We don't need to talk about this. He's cutting off the conversation at this point. It's like somebody says, I want to tell you about this great movie. Really? Did you see it at the Tivoli? I never liked the Tivoli. No. And then it's the person, or better yet, somebody else jumping in and saying, this is what is missing in so many meetings. somebody else jumping in and going, no, the question is not about the theater, the question is about the movie. And that's Jesus is saying, the question is not about the theater, the question is about the movie. Okay? And here Jesus, that's enough. We know, forget about this. That's not, you guys are going off the wrong track here. Okay? And he ended it. And that's the end of the Lord's Supper. I'm sorry, the Last Supper in Luke. Okay, but we've introduced this question about swords. Okay, so keep that sword idea in your mind, because that comes back it's going to come back in a few minutes. In verse 39, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." All right. So he goes into the garden. He goes to the Mount of Olives, and we know from, I think it's Matthew, that he's in the Garden of Gethsemane, or maybe it's John. And he says, "Wait here, and I'm going to go a stone's throw away," which, again, depending on how good your arm is, a stone's throw is 10 feet. It's 100, it's 120 feet. Okay. But it's not, it's far enough away, and keep this in mind, it's far enough away and it's dark. Okay. So Jesus goes out there and he's praying, and the rest of the disciples, now they've just had this big meal. Okay. They just had this big meal. And if it is a full-on Passover, then they've all had 4 cups of this wine. Okay. Now this wine is not suggesting that they're inebriated or anything like this, because the wine that they used back then was alcoholic. There's no question about it, but it was a very low alcohol content. Okay. So the chances of anybody being blindingly drunk or passed out drunk are slim to none. You'd have to drink an outrageous amount, not just 4 cups, in order to get that way. But they've had this big meal. They've had a little bit of wine. And now they come out here, they walked out here, they've had some exercise. It's a night, it's a cool night. They've got a lot to think about. And Jesus says, "Sit here in the dark." Okay. How many of us would stay awake? Probably very few. Okay. We'd be just doing this whole, this whole number kind of thing. Okay. So, and then Jesus goes and prays something interesting, and he's just praying for God's will to be done. And I think this is just kind of the humanity of Jesus we see here, where he just says, "Lord, if there were another way, I'd do it." And I think that's kind of what he's saying. If there were any other way, I would do it, but there isn't. So your will be done, I think is a gist of what he's saying here. But then in verse 43, there's an interesting passage here in verse 43 and 44. "An angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. And being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling to the ground." Okay. Here's the thing with this particular passage. Okay. I think this is added. Okay. I'm not the only one in this. If you have any kind of a modern translation, you'll see there's some translations just take it out altogether. Some of your translations may go right from verse 41 to verse 45. Okay. But in verse 43 and 44 are added, because a couple of things, some of the earlier texts, or most of the earliest manuscripts don't have these 2 verses. Okay. It's believed that there was a that it was added in the 2nd or 3rd century, when there was a heresy going around in church history that suggests, and I can't remember exactly the name, I think it's the Donatist, but I don't remember exactly what it was. But there was a heresy going around that Jesus was not actually human. Okay, that he just kind of was the embodiment, that he looked like a human, that all indications were that he was human, but really he wasn't really human. Okay, that he was God. There was no question about his being God, but he was just manifested in some way so that it would appear to the disciples that he was a human, but in fact he was not. Okay, and what
this verse does is say, well, if he wasn't a human, why did this happen? Now, what this says is there was a tradition at that point that this actually occurred, okay, which may be true, okay. And then somebody just said, someone in the textual transmission universe said, you know what? As he is looking through this passage, understanding that there's this controversy where people say that Jesus wasn't human, and he thinks to himself, you know what? You know that story about Jesus sweating drops of blood? Maybe I should insert it here so that people will see it in the text. Okay, and so it's added. Okay, so, you know, and the other thing is, it specifically talks about what happened, that an angel appeared, okay, and the angel appears and Jesus is sweating drops of blood. Okay, this is something very visual, and yet the disciples don't wake up. Excuse me. If you remember, similar thing on the Mount of Transfiguration, back a few chapters, Jesus goes to pray. He tells the disciples to wait. But when Elijah and Moses show up, the disciples wake up. Something about these guys showing up, something about an angel showing up, though, doesn't wake up the disciples. So nobody actually sees this. Okay. So where does it come from? These two verses aren't in other texts. So they aren't in Matthew, Mark, or John. Don't have this story. Now we do have this story about Jesus praying, not my will but yours. So Luke is looking at, the original writer Luke is looking at the text. He's looking at the stories. He's comparing notes with things, and and I don't think Luke at the time, he sees Jesus praying this. He sees the source. So somehow Jesus told them what he had prayed. Or maybe they heard Jesus praying that, but they don't mention seeing an angel. They don't mention seeing Jesus. None of the other disciples mention seeing this. Okay. Having said all that, it very possibly could have happened. Okay. I personally wasn't there, so, I'm not that old. But I do think the passage was ended. But what it does show is the anguish that Jesus was facing at that moment. And that's kind of the point of why it was added in the first place, to kind of illustrate based on another story. Now, I mean, I don't think that whoever the scribal person that put it in, the scribe that put it in there, made it up. I just think it was another tradition that he thought, hey, maybe if I put that here, that will help with this controversy that's going on that suggests that Jesus was not entirely human. Okay. But it does point out the anguish that Jesus is under at the time. When he arose from prayer and went back to the other disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. Why are you sleeping? He asked them. Get up and pray so that you will not fall into temptation. Okay. Now, this is a common problem with the disciples. And I get it. I mean, the older I get, the harder I find it is to stay awake at all times. But be that as it may, Jesus says, get up, get up that you don't fall into temptation. Okay, because remember, everything changes tomorrow. In fact, everything is going to change in about 10 seconds. Because look in verse 47. While he was still speaking, a crowd came up. Okay, so Jesus is there. It's dark. It's nighttime. The disciples are essentially asleep. He's by himself. He looks up. He sees a crowd approaching. Multiple people. Okay. And we see from the story that even though they got Jesus away from the people, they still expected resistance, hence a crowd. I mean, really, I guess you would have to have enough to take on, 12 guys or 11 guys and Jesus. But he says a crowd comes. One of the 12 was leading them. So, and the man who was called Judas, so now suddenly it's just the man who was called Judas. So again, Luke, it's interesting that all of the gospel writers, have nothing good to say about Judas. Regardless of whether Judas thought he was doing a good thing or not, it didn't play out the way he thought it was going to, and his actions resulted in this, and it required somebody had to finger Jesus, and it was Judas. Okay, somebody had to identify him. Now, many of us, especially if you grew up in the era where hair length was a huge thing. Right now, I'm more concerned with hair presence than hair length, but regardless, we were talking. You would hear this passage, and it was often used to illustrate that Jesus looked like a normal guy. That's why Judas had to point him out. Okay. Again, they didn't have pictures. They didn't have the internet. They didn't have CCTV. Okay. So you couldn't just say, what does Jesus look like? Well, I don't know. He's kind of Jewish looking. Okay. And he certainly, when you see, these pictures of this beatific Jesus with the light glowing around him and all that, if that had been the case, it would have been very easy. Which one is Jesus? Oh, he's the one with the light glowing over him, kind of thing. Well, it wasn't like that. Okay. So Judas has to come up and Judas has to identify him. He figures that's the guy. Okay. The guy that makes the deal. The guy that I kiss. And again, like I said, my opinion is that Judas was going to identify Jesus, point out who Jesus is. And I think Judas was going to do this. He was going to step back. And then Jesus was going to do his thing. Jesus was going to call down 10,000 angels. He was going to become whatever. Okay. But Jesus says to him, he approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him. So again, he comes into, and again, this is a Mediterranean or a Middle East thing where they just kind of do something along that, a kiss on the cheek sort of thing to identify him. But I think Jesus goes, whoa, whoa, whoa. Are you going to betray me with a kiss? And right at that moment, I think Judas realizes, okay, wait a minute. Because it's conceivable that Judas doesn't think he's betraying him. Maybe Judas thinks he's doing a good thing. Perhaps. I'm willing to go that far. But right at this moment, I think Judas realizes, hey, wait a minute. I'm the guy he was talking about. Okay. But regardless, are you going to betray me with a kiss? Okay. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? Here we are with the swords again. Remember, Jesus had said, take the swords. We've got swords. No. But they're missing the point. But now we find out that they've got the swords. And we know from, I think it's the Matthew account, that Peter is one of the ones with a sword. Peter, who is willing to follow Jesus to the death and to prison, has got one of the swords. So in verse 49 and 50, when Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they said, Lord, should we strike with our swords? And one of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. Okay? Now, this is an interesting thing. Whereas one of them is asking, Lord, should we attack? The other one, Peter, has got the sword and he's swinging. Okay? And he cuts off the high priest's servant's ear. Okay? His right ear. Now, what I find interesting about that is just think about how that happened. Okay, you think about a sword. Okay, and I've got a sword thing here. And a sword coming down, if a sword is coming down, it's going to come down and it's going, how do you just cut off the right ear? I mean, does the guy go for it? Maybe something, I don't know. It's just kind of an interesting that what strikes me is that either the Pharisee or the high priest's servant is very agile, or Peter's not that good with a sword. Okay, it's probably the latter. Peter's just not that good with a sword. Or there is a miraculous stopping because, again, Jesus does say, no, none of that. And he heals the man. Now, this is Jesus' last healing. Okay, Jesus' last healing in the Bible, right here. He heals the ear. He just so the guy, and again, this guy doesn't ask to be healed. There's no interchange between Jesus that is recorded between this guy and Jesus. Jesus just immediately heals the guy. Okay, which again, and this is a guy that's here to take Jesus away, and Jesus heals him. Okay, but then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple guard, and the elders who had come for him, "Am I leading a rebellion that you have come with swords and clubs?" He's like, seriously, is this all necessary? I was there every day, kind of, you could have taken me any time. I was there. It would have been easier. Okay. Every day I was with you in the temple courts and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour. when darkness reigns. Okay. You know, and that's an interesting phrase. I kind of like speculate on what he's really talking about. But this is, you know, this is when you do your best work at night kind of thing. Or is he possibly talking to Satan? You know, because Judas is there, Satan is there. Is he just kind of saying, you know, Satan, here you go. This is your hour. Do what you got to do kind of thing. I don't know what he does. But Jesus gets taken away. Verse 54. Then seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. Now, this is a fairly simple story, and I'm just going to kind of read through it. Peter followed at a distance, and some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together. Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." Okay, so this is a servant girl, probably a servant of the high priest. Okay, perhaps she knew the guy whose ear Peter had cut off, because they're in the courtyard of the high priest, right? The house of the high priest. It was the high priest's servant whose ear had been cut off. And now there's another servant of the high priest sees Peter. And we know Peter is recognizable because the man with the water jar recognizes him and says, "Hey, you guys looking for me? Follow me." Okay. Right? So this girl sees him and says, "Hey, you were with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. A little later, someone else saw him and said, "You are with also one of them." Now, we know from one of the other facts that one of the other gospel accounts says it's the same woman, sees him in another light. Says, no, you really are with him. "Man, I am not," Peter replied. About an hour later, another asserted, "Certainly this fellow was with him, for he is a Galilean." Okay? I know in the King James it said, "Your speech betrayeth thee," kind of thing. Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. Now, at that point, does Peter realize what he's doing? Does Peter realize that he's denying Jesus? That he's denying. He has to. And then all of a sudden, he hears the rooster crow, and he comes to mind what Jesus says. And then we find out that Jesus is in sight. Okay. Is this a situation where Peter is outside and the crowd with Jesus is on the porch? Is it an open area where it's all going on in the open? Did Jesus just happen to walk by an open door right at that moment? We don't know. But we know at this moment, the rooster crowed, Peter realizes, he looks up, and he finds Jesus looking right at him. Okay, caught. Then Peter remembered the word the Lord had spoken to him, "Before the rooster crows today, you will disown me 3 times. And he went outside and wept bitterly. So now Jesus is alone. Now we know from other gospel accounts that John is still in the area, but most of the other disciples have fled. So Jesus is on his own, held by these leaders, the guards of the high priest and the teachers of the law. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And they said many other insulting things to him. No doubt they're having a good time. They're having a field day here. They think this is great fun. Finally we got this guy. Now at this point, I suspect, so again, I don't know the exact, I have to figure out the exact timeline one of these days. I think at this point they expected Judas to be there. They expected Judas to be doing a lot of the heavy lifting, but he's not. Okay? And we know from other accounts that Judas realizes what he's done, that it's not working out the way he thought it was going to, that he had taken this small amount of money. Again, the fact that the small amount of money to me suggests that because he wasn't going to get reimbursed for it, he was going to get it when Jesus came into his own. Okay, that's my thought. And they said many other insulting things to him. Verse 66. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before him. Okay. Now, there's some discussion in the commentaries about this particular meeting. Okay. Is this the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body? Is it a sufficient number of them? I don't know. Okay. I don't know exactly who this is. Okay. And some have said, well, this just shows how illegal all of this was. And to a certain extent, that's true. Okay, there are certainly some irregularities in this entire thing. but it's legal enough. Okay, it's legal enough. And that's really about all I'm going to say about it, because it's like, I'm not going to get into the intricacies of Jewish law and describe it. But here I think here they have a decision to make. They were hoping, this is my opinion, they were hoping that Judas was going to be their star witness at this point. That they were going to ask a question and say, so, are you the Messiah? And it didn't matter what they said, they were going to turn to Judas, and Judas, so Judas, what do you say? Oh yeah, he said, okay, great. Well, Judas says you said on multiple occasions that you were the Messiah. Okay, remember you asked who do people say that I am? That Judas was going to tell them that story. But Judas isn't there. So they kind of have to wring a confession out of him. Essentially is what's gonna do it. Okay. If you are the Messiah, they said, tell us. Jesus answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. Okay, so, if I gave you the answer you wanted, and if I were to ask you, you wouldn't answer, why should I answer you? Okay, so, and Jesus isn't going to roll over here. He's not going to make it super easy for these guys. So they say, if you are the Messiah, tell us, they said. Jesus answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. Now, here Jesus is most look at this and say he's claiming the position of that Son of Man figure from Daniel chapter 7. Okay, and we talked about this the first time Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man. That when Jesus says Son of Man, uses the phrase Son of Man, it can mean either representative man or it can mean this God-like figure. And then being sat on the right hand of God certainly indicates a celestial approval that would not go over well with these guys. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God, which in the mind of the people listening here, the Pharisees, who was there? The council of the elders of the people, chief priests, teachers of the law. This is a very God-like position he's claiming. So they say, are you the Son of God? Are you then the Son of God? Are you claiming that position? Are you claiming that position? Are you claiming that deity position here? And he replied, well, you say that I am, And this is kind of tricky. It's like, you say that I am isn't exactly agreeing, but it's not disagreeing. And I think that's kind of the point, that they're going through the motions and they're starting with the accusation. In fact, it's sort of a guilty until proven innocent here. They know that, they've already decided they want to get rid of him. They know they got to ship him over to Pilate. They know they've got to get him on some form, and they're just kind of hoping that he's going to do that. And so rather than go through the motion of collecting evidence and witnesses and all that kind of stuff, and their prize witness, maybe they don't know where their prize witness is. Okay, we know that he's probably dead by now. Maybe they don't know where he is. Maybe they think he's going to show up before they get to Pilate. I don't know. We don't know. It's all speculation on that anyway. But they think it is, And it's like, he didn't say he wasn't. So we're going to go with the fact that he was. When I went to ask my father-in-law, or soon-to-be father-in-law, if I could marry his daughter, it was an odd conversation, okay, and it was an odd. Most of my conversations with my father-in-law tended toward odd, mainly because English was his fourth or fifth language, and so I was always kind of wondering what language he was thinking about me in. But we communicated well enough. And but I went to him, and he was working at his apartment building at the time, and I kind of explained to him that, hey, you know me, we've been dating, and I want to marry your daughter, if that's okay with you. And his reply to me at the time was something along the line of, well, that's life. First Anne, this is my sister-in-law, that's Sam, now you get married, and kind of went on. And I remember when I got to the end of that conversation, although he never didn't say yes, he didn't say yes, please do. He didn't say no. So I went with it, and we've been married for 31 years. But and so it's kind of similar here that he didn't. Maybe the Pharisees, or I guess the Pharisees, the elders, teachers of the law, the chief priest, they say, well, we gave him a chance. We gave him a chance. He didn't say no. So let's send him. We got enough, and maybe our star witness is going to come. So we're going to go take him to Pilate. Okay, and in verse 71, then they said, why do we need any more testimony? We have just heard it from his own lips. So even though it doesn't make sense to us, so even though those of us in 21st century U.S. read this and think, man, I don't know that really, again, it's you got to look at the reaction of the people in the room to kind of indicate whether. So even if it may not seem like much to us, it was enough to them. And again, it was enough in a court case, for lack of a better word, that was legal enough for them to do what they needed to do. So, and then they go off to Pilate. All right. Well, that's all for this. In next week, we're going to talk about chapter 23. And we're going to talk about the crucifixion, death, and the burial. And so we only have two more chapters to go, and then we're done. We're done with Luke. If you have any questions on this, please let me know. You can email me or send, stop me at church if you see me. If you know me, send me a Facebook message, or note on the YouTube channel if you want. I'll be more than happy to answer it if I can. So thank you very much, and I'll talk to you next time.